We're going to be talking about chapter 13, section 3, and it's just titled The Age of Chivalry. And I've always enjoyed reading about castles and knights, and I just think this is really cool stuff. But not only are knights important in warfare, but they're just an important part of the era. And so we're going to spend a little time exploring this. So first off, I am a shameless Lord of the Rings fan. So when I think of knights and I think of, cavalry charges, the most obvious one that comes to mind is from Return of the King, the Charge of the Rohirrim. So here you see the king making a speech, the horns blowing, and the knights charging into battle. And we may get to it in this scene, but if you watch the whole scene, they are 6,000 armored horsemen, a near unstoppable force in battle in the Middle Ages, until a few technological changes. But what makes this possible? These guys are carrying lances, big long spears, 12 feet long. They are wearing heavy metal armor. So they have horses that are specifically trained for this. Some of these guys are carrying axes, some of them are firing arrows. This requires an immense amount of training. But there's a lot of technology that goes into this too. For one, the leather saddle and stirrup. This allows these guys to hold shields and spears and not even hold the horse. Now, can you imagine? So they're holding shields and spears and riding the horse without even holding the horse with their hands. So that's what the leather saddle and stirrups allow for. So for hundreds of years, an army that had horsemen and knights were dominant. And so if you have knights versus infantry, then you get what you're seeing here in the clip. Now, by the year 1000, there are so many different little kingdoms within Western Europe. And each of these nobles have small armies of knights. And each of these nobles are often at war with one another. It's known as the feudal era because these lords have their own armies of knights and are responsible for the lives of serfs and peasants. And so each of these kingdoms are like city-states. And so they're all fighting against one another. And so warfare was a very structured enterprise between private armies of mounted horsemen. But since this requires so much training, since this is so much a part of the popular culture of the time, knighthood went beyond just the battlefield. So we'll see some examples of this. For one, the Code of Chivalry. It's this set of ideas of how to act, that a knight was not just supposed to be this unstoppable force on the battlefield, but that they were to protect the weak and help the poor and serve their Lord and their God, and often a chosen lady. And so if you read the Arthurian legends or Canterbury Tales or any of the popular works of literature from that era, you'll often hear about this concept of courtly love. And it'll be a knight who's smitten with a lady. It could be a princess, it could be a queen, and it's this concept of love, not in the romantic sense, but almost in a worshipful sense, that the knight would commit himself to serve this lady. And he would say he loves her, but not, again, in the romantic sense, it's this chivalric sense. Yes, ma'am.
So, how would you, become a chosen lady? How is
Yeah.
that a thing?
Well, let's say you're a princess, and these knights are committed to fight for your husband, and one of them may just be enamored by you, and so they can't ask you out on a date because you're married to the person they work for, but they might pledge themselves to you, and you would become their chosen lady. They say, "I will fight and die for you." So the Greeks have these different concepts of love. There's eros, which is the romantic version of love. There's agape, which is the worshipful notion of love. And then there's philos, which is a brotherly concept of love. So this would be like the agape, the almost worshipful Eros again being going out on the date. So the chivalric code here is really all about this culture of what it means to be a. Okay, so the next one I wanted to show you, and we'll play it toward the end, but it's about how a young man would train to go into the knighthood. And we'll watch this again after the lesson, but it's called a joust or a tournament. And so young men would sometimes enter the training for knighthood at the age of 7, and they would train most of their lives. And by the age of 21, they might be good enough to be a knight, to take that oath that we were talking about. So, this is the equivalent of majoring in something in college. You are going to go to school, your whole academic life to be a knight, to ride a horse, and to fight on a horse in battle. So, again, we'll watch the tournament in a little while. we'll watch that later. Okay, so we've been talking about this kind of glorified version of warfare, but I wanted to show you a clip here from Braveheart to give you a sense of what actual battle in the Middle Ages was like. It was violent. It was brutal. It's terrifying. So while knights are an important part, and in fact they're going to wind up being the turning point of this battle, they're not the only thing. In fact, the reason why it's called the feudal era is you have these lords with castles developing strong places, strongholds that could protect people in the event of an attack. And so attacking armies had the task of knocking down these walls, of attacking and breaching the walls and taking the castle. And so there's a variety of weapons that we can look at in a little while in terms of how one would go about this. But like I said, there's a culture to this. And this concept that someone would begin at the age of 7 and spend most of their young life learning how to be a knight, and that these people were viewed as heroes, that yes, they were part of larger armies, but when they weren't at war, they would travel the world doing good, apparently. And so there are epic poems. One of your group project options for this week was to study the Song of Roland. It's a story about Charlemagne. It's very romanticized, talking about how he's this heroic figure that would fight and do good for his people. There's a number of these love songs. If you look at the popular literature at the time, a lot of these love songs, again, weren't in the romantic sense. It was almost this worshipful type of language of this chosen lady or this person they were enamored with. And a lot of these stories that we have were from traveling musicians called troubadours. And they would go from town to town and they would tell the stories that really were popular at the time. So, speaking of courtly love, one of the most famous women that knights around the Western Europe had pledged themselves to, that everybody just wanted to be and looked up to, and her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And she was the famous mother of Richard the Lionheart, who led, I believe it was the Second Crusade, to try to retake the Holy Land. So. Now, what's the reality? So there's the ideal, that all women are to be worshipped, that knights are to be great heroes. The reality is that according to the church, according to society at the time, women were to be submissive. They were to be domestic. They were to raise children. They weren't to be in leadership roles. However, some noble women, some wealthy people could inherit land, could be charged with defending the castle when armies would go away. But typically, women were in a very traditional role, especially for the common person. Most women, most families were farmers, and women would work in the fields, would bear children, would provide for their families. But that's it for today. So we'll watch.